Welcome to the kickoff event for the TAPP Fellowship Showcase. My name is Laura Manley, and I'm the director of the Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. The TAPP project was founded by Belfer Center Director and former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. Our mission is to ensure that emerging technologies are developed and managed in ways that serve the overall public good. A critical part of our mission is training and supporting today's leading practitioners in science and technology policy and development, which is why we're so honored to host our inaugural class of TAPP Fellows over the past year. Today's event kicks off our Perspectives in Public Purpose Week, which is a week-long showcase of the TAPP Fellowship cohort's research, projects, and top insights. Sessions will explore tech and public purpose topics ranging from surveillance and data privacy, health data governance, science and technology expertise and governance, and many more. Today, Secretary Carter will host a conversation with our fellows looking back at the past year and more specifically, how technology has created new challenges for society, but also fostered public purpose in a whole new way. Over to you, Ash.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I'm on now. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this event in which I'm very pleased and very proud and very optimistic for the future to be able to introduce you to our 7 TAPP Fellows in our inaugural class of TAPP Fellowships at the Belfer Center here at Harvard. The logic behind this is that I'm a technologist. I've spent my entire life in one way or another interacting with technology, and I've seen so many wonderful things that technology has brought to our world. At the same time, when I was working in physics, I was always told that with the knowledge, the transformative knowledge that comes with technology, comes responsibility also. The responsibility to ensure that you not only maximize the good from technology, but you work also to minimize the detrimental effects of technology. And that's what we're dedicated to do in the Technology and Public Purpose program, and whatever kind of technology it is, whether it's digital or biotech or any other kind. And we have 2 kinds of products, 2 ways of contributing. So I like to continue to contribute to public life now that I'm not in government. And my way of doing that is this. And one product is good ideas that can help carry us forward in technology and public purpose. And the other is to help a group of people, new group of people, to enter the field and be effective leaders in the field of technology and public purpose. And that's what you're going to get to do today, is hear from 7 of those future leaders. Just one remark, which is about the year we're coming out of. Here we are meeting on Zoom. And the last year has been really an inelastic deformation of our technological world. So it's been a very interesting and unwanted experiment in technology, mostly for good, but also for bad. For good, it has been technology which has permitted us to continue to operate our economy, albeit at a lesser level, even as we socially distance and protect ourselves and protect employees and obey public health guidelines. Interestingly, this phenomenon, which we have been driven to, has had the effect of accelerating the adoption of automation in the workplace, artificial intelligence, and other tools. It's also been an amazing year for biotech. The distribution of safe and effective vaccines in multiple varieties, in record time, and then their provision in what is, for most people, the first time they've ever really consciously experienced the public health system, which is an example of a technology and public purpose system, probably the oldest one in history. And in the end, at least in some countries, including the United States, successfully, in the sense that as I speak now, they're approaching half of the population of the United States that have been vaccinated, with the rest in sight. Also big this year was the George Floyd incident and everything surrounding it, and the reminder that we have that the burden of racism weighs heavily upon us. There's nothing good to say about that, except that the murder of George Floyd was possible to prosecute because technology gave us that awful 9-minute video. So you can imagine in a previous time when an event like that would have gone unrecorded and a murder unavenged. Next, this year of kind of good news, it's funny good news in a way, but shutdowns were sure good for the climate. And if any of you have looked at pictures of the Los Angeles skyline this year and have lived or traveled in LA for many years, you'll see a striking distance. So it's been a year in which technology helped us quite a bit. At the same time, as in everything else, when we make an advance like this, there's usually a dark side to it. And as we enjoy the upside, we need to ameliorate the downside. And so in the vaccine rollout, for example, that was not entirely smooth and even, which showed differences of opportunity, but also differences in understanding and acceptance of public health as a collective technological good. There are many people who resisted the measures that seemed necessary to the public health experts, and even resisted accepting scientific fact as more than an opinion. As we contact traced, we had to worry, as we always need to worry, about the constant prying into our private life associated with digital media. Great stuff comes with it, but a latent price that is not evident to many people. And wonderful as the ability to do events like this from home and thereby continue to enjoy community and especially continue to enjoy employment has been, we can never forget that this is not an option for many people. And their jobs could not be done without compromising their safety, and they did it, starting with healthcare workers. And also many of them, because of COVID, lost their jobs, and because their jobs couldn't be conducted in this way. So it's been a big year for technology, a mixed year, but almost every year is a big year in technology. And in every case, you see the goods and the bads here. And what we want to do today is hear from these 7 amazing people who have been working on very distinct projects. So that's been really interesting to those of us who work with them in very, very different areas of this. In fact, I think we kind of span the whole space of what's happening in technology today. I'm going to name them, and then I'm going to call on one of them to kind of start us off and say a little something about herself and what in her area She's seen this year, in the year of COVID, that's worked out pretty well. And then, of course, we'll turn to the other side of it as well. The fellows are, and this is in alphabetical order, Clare Bayley, Flavia Chen, Devin Gladden, Mark Lerner, Jake Taylor, Liz Sisson, and Rebecca Williams. So let me start with you, Flavia, if I could. If you would say, first of all, a few sentences about yourself, and then about what's happening in your domain. Let's start with the positive side, but you can drift into the negative side as well. I don't want to be too simplistic here. So go right ahead.
Sure, thank you, Secretary Carter. I'm Flavia Chen, and I think that Secretary Carter has basically already introduced my TAPP project by talking about public health over the course of last year. My TAPP project examines data governance in the context of public health along two threads. One sort of historical, looking at our public health systems and asking how did we get to where we are today. And the other side is more normative, examining what constitutes trustworthy practices in the use of health data for public health. And so these are really challenging questions, but I think central to TAPP. And most fundamentally maybe is, do we share a definition of public in terms of the public good? So over the course of 2020, Secretary Carter already pointed out, I think one of the most visible ways that science and technology enabled public health has been through the development of multiple safe and effective vaccines. And it's a phenomenal story. And I hope that, the best history of science writers will document the story of 2019 and 2020. Dr. Catalin Carico's persistent work on mRNA over the past 30 years, the work of immunologists, geneticists, lipid biochemists. But from the standpoint of public health, the development and distribution of vaccines is only one part of the very visible tip of the iceberg that's public health. And so I've come to appreciate the significant role that data sharing and data governance also plays at every step along the way, from Dr. Zhang Yongzhen and his colleagues in China uploading the viral sequence of COVID-19 to GenBank. That was a practice of data sharing in an open access database run by the NIH's National Center of Biotechnology and Information. That was really vital to the rapid development of vaccines. But I'm equally interested in understanding the upstream infrastructures that are vital to public health and may have worked better or worse. In the US, we have a very fragmented public health system. And we saw that play out. We're seeing it play out both in COVID testing and now in vaccine distribution. So that's that's a positive and a slight bit of the negative.
I'm going to go to Devin next, but Flavia, on the mixed side, a lot of people don't seem to accept public health strictures, and I think it's been under the water for so long that we're surprised. We're used to getting vaccine. We're used to doing kind of modest things and seeing signs that instruct us here and there, and nobody's ever really questioned that. But when a little more was asked of people, they wouldn't give. Did your work bear on that question?
Yeah, I think what that points to is, we have a very autonomy-focused conception of public health in the US. And when we're asking people to act on behalf of each other, that can be really challenging. But I would say there have been really great examples also of us sort of moving into that broad conception of public good, or is public health a public good that requires us to act collectively. And so, here I've been thinking a lot about Elinor Ostrom's work on governing commons and common pool resources, and starting to think, can we conceive of public health data as a public good? What does that look like in terms of data governance?
Devin, how about you? Same basic discussion, goods and the bads, and what you've been doing to make it so that we get the goods without the bads in a very, very explosive area of technology advance.
Thanks, Secretary Carter. So to begin, my research has been focused on understanding how public opinion will impact the deployment of automated vehicles. And this has been a really interesting year to understand not only how the industry is developing, but the technology is developing as well. And more importantly, really where we'll see consumer use cases develop over time that will really determine how many of these vehicles we see on the roads and what sort of situations they are in. So for over the past year, we've seen two really important areas in this industry develop. The first has been, we've seen an increase in the number of pilot programs. So you might imagine as a result of the pandemic, there has been a lot less traffic on the roads, and that has created sort of the perfect environment for researchers who want to understand more about the real world use of their vehicles on highways and roads across the country. And we've seen states sort of race to become innovation hubs, creating different regulatory environments and business models and supporting the use of business models that all sorts of companies have been eager to deploy. And I think we'll continue to see that even as we emerge out of the pandemic. The second big area that's been an important one because of this year has been the understanding more use cases for the vehicles. I think everyone can agree that our frontline workers who've been delivering packages have really been supportive in helping to keep our economy going in the face of the pandemic. And that has created new openings for automated vehicle developers to partner with retailers to understand how might we deploy this technology to continue supporting the delivery economy that's growing and emerging. And we will continue to see that moving forward. And I think as a result of that, my research has kind of fit in nicely because I really wanted to understand in particular how the public understood these pilot programs and how are they being designed and to ensure that we see the benefits and not the harms of the deployment of these vehicles.
It's so interesting. The heart of what you've been working on is public acceptance. It's a little bit related to Flavia's thing. It's not enough that technology make advance. In the case, society has to accept it. And in the case of an automobile, which people have such an intimate relationship to cars and the streets and mobility and so forth, your work on what are the key questions that people have in their minds that need to be answered in governance before they'll accept AVs. That's the heart of it. It's very interesting. It's very connected to Devin. Those of us who are technologists somehow, we tend to overlook the adoption part. And if you get the innovation done, you say, well, what's the matter with you? Why don't you like this? And in both your cases, you're pointing to the importance of doing actual work to understand how to make technology more acceptable to people. It's interesting what you said about, and with no cars on the road, it's great. You can put driverless cars out there and do what you want. Liz, let's go to you next. Same thing, Liz, but tell people what you've been doing.
Sure. Hi, I'm Liz Sisson. Over the last year, I've been focusing on venture capital and public purpose. So how particularly early stage investors can think more about the environment, labor, privacy, security, diversity, inclusion, and just overall long-term value creation. So venture capital is obviously booming. It has been for a while. I think over the last year, even with the pandemic, we've just seen a major surplus in assets under management and money going to wonderful startups. We obviously see tons of jobs being created, tons of opportunity being created, and innovation as a whole just really pushing the boundary in venture capital. But on the other side of that, there's also major concerns around labor, diversity, of course, environmental concerns. And so often we see the regulators or the startup founders really holding on to that responsibility and trying to mitigate those issues. But my research has basically been saying that investors, particularly in the early stage, should take on some of that responsibility and diligence before they make investments, but also post-investing when they sit on board seats, for instance, or when they sit on boards, for instance, and what that could actually look like. We oftentimes see ESG or impact investors do a pretty good job with mitigating the negative consequences of venture-backed startups. But I think that there's a business argument that generalist investors should also care more about these things. I mean, there's growth opportunities, there's profitability opportunities, liquidity, when attracting talent at these startups or reducing legal fees. So really just, we've been focusing on what could that look like in diligence and what could that look like in post-investing to care about public purpose.
It's interesting to me, Liz, and I've learned a lot of this from you, that in this field, which we, you first tend to think of as, well, intellectually, we know that something is good, like the environment, it's important to get investment going there. But we all know that that is not what motivates actual investment. What motivates actual investment is appetites for things, but there is an appetite for ESG values. And just like people are willing to pay for a car or a movie, they're willing to pay for that as well. And it's as valid a consumption item, if you say, as anything else. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially over the last year with COVID and all of our issues around climate change, when we talk about racial issues, I think there's been this awakening in the VC space and for their limited partners, the folks that invest in those VC funds. Even out of Europe, there's been a massive surge in interest in thinking about ESG and impact and public purpose. There's a lot of emphasis on the positive impact. So can this service or can this product create a positive impact? And less emphasis on the negative side. So even if this thing becomes widely popular or if it's widely adopted, what could negatively happen, right? So if we're looking at natural resources or labor issues, or they're, around privacy and security. So it's really a matter of bringing in a lot of the social sciences and whatnot into an investing process to really think thoughtfully about these things and try to get ahead of the possible negative consequences. A lot of investors have a lot of power and they have a lot of say in how startups are built. So with that comes a lot of responsibility, and taking it earlier and laying a solid public purpose foundation just makes for better startups and better technology in the long run.
It's a really interesting project because everybody thinks of VC as the dynamo of innovative change, which it is. It's actually just one of several in reality, but kind of all the focus is on that. And you have taken the concept of ESG, which most of us have associated historically with big established corporations, into the startup world. And that's a really creative product. Clare Bayley, you also have had a busy year.
Yes, I have. So my project here at TAPP has been looking at the censorship of sexual content on social media and ways to make that space more sex positive. My entire career has been in technology. I've worked for Google, I've worked for the White House, and I've worked for startups, so kind of the whole range. Along with that has been a kind of ongoing interest in human sexuality, and especially the representation in media of how we learn the patterns we adopt and how we have gotten to this point in society where I think we can all agree there's some pretty unhealthy views about sexuality that go around. Technology has been a complicated force in this field. On the positive side, the internet has been amazing for communities of all kinds, right? Like you talked a lot about everything that happened with George Floyd this year. Like the internet was incredible for both sharing the unfortunate videos and also bringing people together around it. It's done a lot of similar things for sexuality, like people can share feelings much easier. People can find each other. You're not alone with your feelings anymore. You can go online and find other people.
Clare, you have frozen. So I'm going to come back to you. I'll remember, I think we all will, exactly where we are with you. And let me go next to Jake with a promise to come back to Claire when you work out your connection issue. Jake.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm happy to drop off if Claire comes back in time. So basically, a little bit like Liz, actually, I've been focused on the tools that support technology development, particularly long-term development of technologies. I come from the government, so I've been working as a scientist, a physicist in a relatively esoteric field of quantum computing, and spent the last few years working actually at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where we tried our darndest to create an integrated program that enabled an effective development of this technology in a way that's good for the nation and good for the public. And from that, I've been here at the TAPP Fellowship here looking at ways to create or improve the tools that the government has to support a public purpose in long-term and emerging technologies. And in terms of the year, it's been a very interesting year for the government connection to these technologies. For those of you tracking what's happening on the Hill, Congress has been pushing forward a bill, the Endless Frontiers Act, which looks to transform technology development across the nation, spending $100 billion over 5 years, for example. And the question is, do we have the pieces in place that allow us not just to create technology, but create technology that enables good? Some of the challenges that we're looking at is, of course, first, one of the biggest drivers, nationalism and great powers competition. This is something that gets bills through Congress, is something that gets people excited, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the resulting technology you create is good for the average citizen on the street. It more often creates economic drivers rather than sort of improvements of quality of life drivers. And so there's this big question, which is, how do we solve the meta problem of technology development? How do we better integrate how people build technology with those who are impacted by it? So my TAPP here has been focused a lot on that question. We have some policy briefs and white papers, just really to kind of tie it together though. For me, the key story is figuring out a better way to integrate the developers, the end users, the early adopters, and the impacted communities into a community around technologies. So that as you build the technology, first of all, you get faster market because you have the early adopters in the room, but also you're ahead of those negative impacts. And by bringing the government, having the government be a mediator or moderator at the table, you have the broader sense, a political sense, lowercase p, of what is good for society being determined by the people in society. So that's been the overall focus. I think we've made some progress in developing some ideas around that, particularly a white paper focused on an emerging area in climate technologies. But fundamentally, there's a lot more to be done. And I'm excited to have spent this last year building some of those foundational tools, but I'm looking forward to building some more.
You know, Jake, you have a central focus in everything you did, which is not just public purpose and public institutions, but public-private partnerships.
Yes.
And I think the US valued answer to, hey, look at communist China and how dynamic communism is it really true that our system is better than their system in this particular matter of creating new technology and creating new wealth? And I think if their secret sauce is statism, our secret sauce is public-private partnership. Do you agree with that thesis? And as a sort of overall characterization of your work?
Yeah, I do agree with that thesis. I think that we have an unfettered private market space, which venture capital covers very effectively. But if you look at the most transformative technologies, there's a substantial element of government support, both at the scientific level, building of the pieces, and also at the technology development level, being one of the first buyers of a technology, being a supporter of the subcomponents in the supply chain, and providing a framework, a market framework and a political framework for the people and the product to happen. right? So for example, the Section 230, which is a very important early internet law, was a type of public-private integration of what would be good for the public based on the Congress at the time and what we could do in the private sector. But what I'm trying to add to that is not just these one-off moments, but that long-standing institutional memory of what matters and why, and the tools at the more regulatory or agency level to actually meld the public purpose component and the technology together over time. So to add some resiliency and direction, and so that we don't get caught in scenarios where we've grown too big for our britches.
When I was Secretary of Defense, building new institutional bridges like the Defense Innovation Unit, as in exactly to instantiate the principle you're talking about, was a big priority. And I hope that continues. Claire, you're back, are you? I want you to pick up where you left off, but Jake was also just mentioned 230, Section 230, which is central, and he said it was an instance, Jake, if I can make a slight emendation to that, it's a 25-year-old instance. If you think that's a pretty long instance, and it's almost prima facie the case that a technological rule made a quarter century ago needs some kind of updating. And Claire, maybe at some point you can loop back to that point, but please pick up where you left off because you just froze.
Sorry about that. My internet here is very bad. So there's lots of positives for the internet in terms of kind of humans and their sexuality. There's a lot of negatives from technology as well. I think the ones that get talked about most often and the ones that were some of the things that the other side of Section 230, people talk about Section 230 and what people kind of like get to take down. Well, there are things that everybody should take down, right? Like child pornography is what usually gets talked about. The internet has allowed that to proliferate far more easier than anything else ever could. And that's very bad. There's also a lot of very low quality, poor educational pornography that's out there that a lot of children are learning about their sexuality from. That is not a healthy thing. And then there's the other side of these arguments. There's a lot of bad stuff that gets talked about that gets taken down. But these laws, the content moderation that companies are able to do because of 230, because it allows them to kind of take stuff down with impunity, but another view of it enables them to do content moderation, right? Like it allows them to take down the bad stuff as well, is that they can take down a lot of good stuff. And so this is kind of the point of my project here, is that in these attempts to take down the bad stuff, a lot more good stuff gets taken down than the bad. In theory, all social media platforms have an exemption for educational content, but there is a whole lot of educational content that just gets pulled off on a routine basis. There's a whole lot of content from diverse body types, diverse sexualities, diverse relationship types that gets pulled down that really doesn't break the rules. Like there's a lot of this stuff that like—
Give an example in the educational field, Claire, not to interrupt you, but just to be vivid about it. Not too vivid, but in the education field, for example.
Yeah, so my go-to example for this, mostly because it makes me very angry still, is that there's a link on a website called Scarletine, which is a really great, inclusive, high-quality sex education website for teenagers. They have a page on barrier use. It's literally instructions on how to use a condom. You can't get much more educational than that. You cannot send a link to this page via one-to-one private message on Facebook. It just blocks it. It just throws up this little red thing. I'm gonna do a live demo of this if you come to my session on Thursday. So it's stuff that kind of should be obvious. Like obviously you want that content to be out there. Now I don't know which of Facebook's filters or human components or what is the thing that tags this, but I first heard about this about 1.5 years ago, and I've been kind of checking this link periodically since then, and you still can't send it. So that's my go-to example of educational content.
Well, it's interesting because so much of the talk around this phenomenon is about alleged political censorship. that is taking down content that is allegedly politically inflammatory, but to other people is privileged speech. And you're in this completely different domain of it, which is really interesting. What do we do, Claire?
It's complicated. I would agree that Section 230 needs reform. I don't know what the best solution is yet. Am I frozen again?
No, you're not.
No, okay, sorry, my other thing froze on my other screen. Excellent, I'm still here. I think we need to be a lot more respectful of the content that should stay up, right? What you're talking about in terms of the political stuff and hate speech, people talk often about the harms of stuff that gets left up that should be taken down. And my viewpoint is more the harms of stuff that gets taken down that should be left up. And there's not really much conversation about that. There's not a lot of kind of respect given to the kinds of content that I'm talking about. I mean, sexual shame is so prevalent in our society. In our legislature, I've been doing a review of Supreme Court cases for this project, and there's some sexual shaming that's just built into law. Like the verbiage from some of the original censorship cases is appalling. And so I think we need to stop being afraid to talk about this and give it the respect it deserves.
Okay. Let's go to Rebecca next, if you would. Rebecca, I think you're all getting a sense from where we have been so far, and we're not done yet, of both the enormous spread of substantive interests of these people, but also where it all comes together, or whether techniques and perspectives that work in one area turn out to work, or at least inspire things that work in an entirely different area of technology. And that's a reason why at TAPP, we try to be inclusive of all these. We're fascinated by them all, but also they speak to one another when it comes to providing solutions to dilemmas, which is what we're all about. Rebecca.
Yeah, great segue. So my name's Rebecca Williams. My TAPP focus is studying smart city technology harms and prevention tactics. I was inspired by a series of protests related to smart city projects, such as the Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto. I definitely have overlap with some of the other TAPP projects, which I can bring up. But in terms of positives of this large set of emerging technologies, which the only thing they really have in common is tracking various things in public space or the urban built environment. The pros would be understanding our world and ourselves better, and the cons would be this long list that I've been working on, including sort of traditional privacy harms, but also secondary chilling effects, such as perhaps if you think you're being tracked, then you don't protest. Also, just larger questions about democracy. Did folks ask for this tracking to happen? If they're tracking you, are they asking you what you want in terms of policy, discrimination, privatization, leading with data collection first versus any other possible solution with tax dollars. In terms of how this project has intersected with 2020, 2021, everything you brought up, Ash, smart city tech was there. the COVID-19 tracing, smart city tech like temperature scanning in public spaces was there. The Black Lives Matter unprecedented amount of protests. There was a lot of streetlight cameras filming those protesters. What was the other? Climate change with the fires in California. There's a lot of air quality sensors letting folks know when they could go out. That's all sort of technically under the umbrella of my research project. In terms of how I've gotten an opportunity to work with the other fellows, Flavia, who you've already heard from, has talked about public health surveillance, which has a lot of overlap with a positive potential of some of these public space surveillance collections. Liz talked about public purpose in private sector development, and a lot of my research has been about not just government policy improvements, but also making sure that the private sector and the social sector is doing all that they can to tackle this project from all sides. You haven't heard from Mark yet, but his work in government technology, tech capacity and knowledge is certainly needed in my solution as well. So there's a lot of overlap with things that I've researched, but essentially I'm looking at a really broad issue in society of information policy and like what decisions we're making about it, from a specific lens of what happens when we make public spaces spaces where people are tracked all the time. What do we give up from all that data that we gather? Is it really worth it?
So your project is, and Devin's are related in the sense that they both talk about patterns of life in non-cyberspace, in the real world, and acceptance of technology changing those patterns, his in mobility and yours in all of aspects of urban life. Mark, you have a link also which to that subject and also to something that Jake's been taught. Jake was talking about public-private relationship in the generation of technology. You did a lot of work on public-private partnership in effect in the governance of technology, which is kind of at the other end of the pipeline. Tell us what you did and what you found out.
Sure. Thanks for the intro. My name is Mark Lerner. My research here at the TAPP project has been focused on government technology projects, why they tend to fail almost by default, and what can we do to stop that and to fix that. I think the last year has actually been a really good survey of technology projects that have unfortunately failed. We used to have healthcare.gov as the baseline example, but after this year, we now see unemployment insurance systems, vaccine deployment systems, vaccine registration systems, all sorts of different websites and software systems that the government, both at the federal level, at state and at local levels, have used that have almost all to a one failed in some way or another. People have been frustrated with them. They haven't been deployed correctly, even security breaches in different cases. With SolarWinds and other aspects. So my work has been focused on why is that the case? And I sort of cover three different topic areas. One is exactly as you mentioned, Secretary Carter, the governance aspect, the fact that we structure our government software development systems such that the default way of building these things is such that they fail. So even if we pump in more and more money, as we are doing now with the passage of the new COVID rescue plan and the various different bills and budget items that are coming through from the White House's 2022 budget requests, actually, we're seeing billions of dollars going into investments in the in government technology space. I think that none of those are going to go to good use if we keep doing things the way that we have been doing them, if we keep using the standard governance structures. The second piece, which is more of what I've been focusing on lately and what Rebecca mentioned, is we don't have the right talent in government. We've been missing out on the investment of actually bringing in high quality technical talent into government. And it's a very challenging thing to do, but just as the last year has shown us a lot of examples of where things have gone wrong, it's also shown us a lot of opportunities of where things can go right. We've seen thousands of technologists, software developers, product managers, designers, engineers, coming out of their private sector jobs or other sectors and saying, I want to go work in the government. I want to go work on problems that I care about. We have not yet seen a government that is able to take in all the different amounts of talent that it needs, but a lot of people are focusing on this problem. Organizations like the Tech Talent Project, the Day One Project, even efforts within government such as the Subject Matter Expert Qualifications Assessment, which is a mouthful to say. But there's a lot of efforts to try and actually bring in a lot of talent. And again, just as Rebecca mentioned, there's a lot of overlap with a bunch of the different work by the different fellows, because the more technology talent we have in government, the more that we're going to be able to actually build services that work for people, regardless if that's public health or if that's deployment of new technology for transportation or for smart cities or what have you.
Let me ask you guys, I'm going to ask everybody a question, and this is going to kind of be a lightning round because the hour is almost up, and I'm just going to go in alphabetical order here. And the question is this, and Claire, that means you're first, so start your gears starting. If you had to name kind of one product that came out of your research, one thing that people would look at and say, now that's a useful way of looking at things, or that would be a good tool for people to adopt. I know you have many, but just one example.
Yeah, a lot of the things I looked at were the harms of existing products, but one of the content strategies that I think doesn't get as much credit as it deserves is the opt-in filter on a lot of things. Twitter is one of the better, though not great, examples of this, right? Where it's possible to have so-called adult content on a platform mixed in with a bunch of other stuff while still removing the actual harmful content, like I mentioned. And it's just click to see, and they have options where you can be like, I want to see this, I don't. It defaults to no, you turn it to yes, and then you can see stuff. Like, again, Twitter's not the greatest example. I certainly have my beefs with them, but in terms of like opt-in filters for this stuff, like that's a really good example of a content I would love to see elsewhere.
Interesting. That's exactly the kind of thing I wanted to get at. Flavia, how about you?
So I think I'm going to disappoint you because my brain doesn't work in products. That's just not the way that
I'm using that in quotation marks.
What's
that? I'm using that in quotation marks. Idea, mechanism, something people can grab onto and say, that's something we could actually do.
Right. So I think what I would flag for people is, 2019, 2020, we've recognized the fragmentation of our public health infrastructure in the US. And I'm grateful that the Biden administration has sort of put the financial spotlight on that and said, we're going to invest very heavily in public health infrastructure modernization. But what I would add to that is not forgetting the social side. And, I think that something that he's done by nominating a sociologist, and Dr. Lerner Nelson, to be his deputy science advisor for science and technology policy, I think that is a sort of overt way that he's bringing into attention, like, this isn't just about technology. Public health is what we do collectively on behalf of each other. And we've lost sight of that in the US for, I think, over 30 years. It's been tremendously underfunded. And going forward, bringing both the science and the technology and society together, I think, is what I want people to go away with.
That's a really interesting example and a perfect example of what I meant. Devin.
So I would actually point to my upcoming blog post entitled, When Will We Trust Self-Driving Cars? Because in it, I actually include 4 elements of public acceptance that I was able to identify through my research that I really think regulators, as we see more pilot programs being developed and we see more of these vehicles deployed on the roads, that regulators really need to contemplate in order to see and to support deployment of these vehicles instead of the harms.
It's interesting. I've read drafts of that. I look forward to it, but that's based in part on the one of the ways you performed the research was actually to ask people. And it's kind of interesting that we don't all have to sit back and guess. You can actually ask people what they'd care about if they saw a self-driving car go by, what their concerns are.
It's the
Mark.
Purpose.
Yep. Mark.
Yeah, so I've been putting together a number of different frameworks that people can use to think about, by people I mean chief information officers and other CXO roles within government, to think about how they can best take advantage of the incoming wave of technology talent. So how to determine whether or not something should be insourced or in-house or outsourced, where to start staffing people up first, what roles to focus on above others. And these kinds of frameworks I'm putting out there as a way to make sure that we can actually take advantage of all the people that want to serve in the public sector and put them to use on the services that we all need.
Awesome. Liz.
My team and I have thought a lot about what the best theory and action of change should be. for VCs in public purpose. First step is really just acknowledging their responsibility when it comes to emerging technology. And then from there, figuring out sort of what their values are and how they really want to envision the future. We have created 2 different sort of tools that investors and startups can use to evaluate technology. So we have one, which is a playbook, which is it's a very straightforward book that both investors and startups can use to sort of guide them through a lot of these areas of public purpose. So if they have no experience learning about economic inequality or labor or the environment, privacy, security, they can use our playbook to sort of learn about these things and apply it in their day-to-day at their fund. And then we also have developed a tool that VCs can use to bring their startups through diligence to sort of alert themselves and the startups to possible areas of harm when it comes to public purpose and sort of how they can plan to prevent those harms before they really go into place. So it's really like a futures thinking exercise.
Playbook's a good word. Jake.
So I would say that of all the different blog posts and policy briefs and white papers that I've been working on this year, actually the first one was the most important. And that is really putting down in words and clearly a concept which I call a public purpose consortium, which is a meta tool in the public-private partnership space. It's not focused on private sector executing public sector funding. It's focused on enabling a responsive development of emerging technologies with government integration supporting private sector efforts and private sector efforts supporting public mission and doing that in a sustained manner. It's based off some of my experiences with the Quantum Economic Development Consortium and the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium, but it's a meta tool that can be applied to other areas of long-term emerging technology. So if you've got a problem that there isn't a market today, but you know there's going to be a market in 5 to 10 years, and the government should be playing a role to make this a good technology. This is the tool I'd encourage you to consider.
Playbooks, tools, meta tools, this is the kind of thing that we're looking for. And Rebecca, you're last, but not least.
Did we skip Mark? So I'll go. I have grounded calls to action. And by grounded, I mean they're very based in a lot of different examples of what's already happening for whether you're just a person in a city government employee, or you work for one of these companies. I have a set of like very clear calls to action of things that are already happening and ways to tap in with an outline of sort of this harm space. So if you're like, oh, I'm curious about what all this tracking is, you'll have a very like clear set of next steps and then people that you can reach out to in that space.
Mark, apologies.
I think that we covered myself.
I think you did too. But want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to come back. Listen, unfortunately, I could do this all day because you're all so amazingly smart and constructive, and all of these fields are so different and so vitally important. But I think the audience gets a sense of the excitement of the TAPP program and what amazing people we're fortunate to have here. Laura has some acknowledgements to make at the end of this hour, and then this kind of activity will be going on all week. Laura.
Okay, thank you everyone for participating in today's conversation. But before we wrap up, I want to share some broader thank yous. First, thanks to Ash for believing in the importance of training and mentorship and using this platform to elevate others, to our expert mentors for supporting our fellows and their research throughout the year, our speakers and trainers that lent their valuable time and expertise to the program and our fellows, our funders that took a leap of faith to support this new type of fellowship here at TAPP, and countless others that have helped elevate our program, our fellows, and their work. I want to thank Karen Ejiofor and Amrita Jayante for their tireless work developing this program from scratch and twice, once in person and then suddenly an entire virtual program. They've been instrumental in everything from training sessions to virtual networking events to mentorship placements. This program seriously would not be possible without their hard work. Specifically, Karen, she's been a full-time grad student this entire year and will be wrapping up her first full year next week. So she's a total rock star. I also want to thank our inaugural fellows. I'm sure this year was definitely not what you imagined when you signed up for an in-person fellowship in Cambridge. So thank you for persisting and keeping it all going, even on the hardest days. Despite being a part, you've really exceeded our expectations for what it means to be the good in tech and public purpose. And lastly, to everyone tuning in, thank you for joining the kickoff for this entire week. Please join us for the follow-up 7 sessions. I've just added a link to all of the follow-up sessions throughout the week. In particular, we have a follow-up session starting in 2 minutes at 12 p.m. with Jake Taylor. Also put that link in the chat. So again, thank you all for the people that have helped support and develop this program, participated, and joined in for today's session. We'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.